विशेषकर समसामयिक काल में विज्ञान कथा साहित्य के आगमन और हालिया तकनीकी प्रगति ने विज्ञान कथा साहित्य और फंतासी साहित्य के भारतीय संस्करण के उद्भव को संभव किया है। विज्ञान कथा साहित्य प्रायः मनहूस दुनिया का चित्रण प्रस्तुत करता है, लेकिन साथ ही यह संभावनाओं का संसार भी चित्रित करता है तथा हम आज के समय में जिन बातों के साक्षी हो रहे हैं वे 100 साल पहले के समय के लिए मनहूसियत नहीं थी, लेकिन यह आज की वास्तविकता है। क्लासरूम में संवर्धित यथार्थ का आगमन बहुत जल्दी संभव हो सकता है तथा तकनीक आश्चर्यचकित कर सकती है। इस सत्र में प्रख्यात कल्पनाशील विज्ञान लेखकों द्वारा वैश्विक एवं भारतीय संदर्भों में फंतासी एवं विज्ञान कथा साहित्य पर विचार विमर्श किया जाएगा। हम ये सत्र प्रारंभ करें इसके पहले मैं चाहूँगी एक बार जोरदार तालियां हो जाए ताकि पूरा हमारा जो सभागार है वो ऊर्जामय हो जाए। और इसी खूबसूरत सी तालियों के बीच में इस कार्यक्रम की अध्यक्षता करने के लिए बहुत ही आदर के साथ आमंत्रित कर रही हूँ आदरणीय साधना शंकर जी को। कृपया आप आएँ और आज के सत्र का आप अध्यक्षता स्वीकार करें। आदरणीय साधना शंकर जी, आप लेखिका और सिविल सेवक हैं। आपने दिल्ली विश्वविद्यालय से सीरियाई अर्थव्यवस्था इतिहास पर पीएचडी की उपाधि प्राप्त की है। आपकी 6 पुस्तकें प्रकाशित हैं। आपका नवीनतम ब्लॉग पोस्ट का एक संग्रह है व्हेन द कन्वर्ज्ड। आपके कथा साहित्य पर नेवारा डिस्कनेक्ट एसेंडेंस नामक विज्ञान कथाएं शामिल हैं, जिनका अनुवाद आरोहण के नाम से हिंदी में भी किया गया है। आप राष्ट्रीय और अंतर्राष्ट्रीय अंग्रेजी दैनिकों के लिए भी लिखती रही हैं। वर्तमान में आप दैनिक भास्कर, लोकमत टाइम्स और द साउथ एशियन टाइम्स के मासिक स्तंभ में योगदान देती हैं। आप ब्लॉग भी करती हैं। आपने दूरदर्शन में सूत्रधार, उद्घोषिका और अभिनेत्री के रूप में भी कार्य किया है। आप सबकी मधुर तालियों के बीच हम बहुत बहुत स्वागत करते हैं हमारी अध्यक्षा आदरणीय साधना शंकर जी का। और आप ही के साथ मंच को साझा कर रहे हैं आदरणीय श्री अनिल मेनन जी। हम उन्हें भी बहुत ही आदर और सम्मान के साथ मंच पर आमंत्रित कर रहे हैं। आदरणीय इरा मुरुकन जी, हम आपको भी बहुत ही आदर के साथ मंच पर आमंत्रित करते हैं। हमारे साथ चित्रा देव कारुणी जी भी वर्चुअल हमारे बीच जुड़ी हुई हैं, तो हम उनका भी बहुत बहुत स्वागत करते हैं। और इसी के साथ हमारी जो एक बहुत ही खूबसूरत सी परंपरा है कि हम अपने कार्यक्रम के सत्र की शुरुआत एक अतिथि स्वागत के साथ करते हैं, तो इसके लिए मैं आदरणीय सी मृणालिनी, मेंबर एग्जीक्यूटिव बोर्ड साहित्य अकादमी को बहुत ही आदर और सम्मान के साथ आमंत्रित करती हूँ। कृपया आप आएं और मंचासीन अतिथियों का स्वागत करें। आदरणीय सी मृणालिनी जी। सर्वप्रथम हमारी अध्यक्षा आदरणीय साधना शंकर जी का स्वागत करें। पहुंच रहे हैं, आपका भी बहुत बहुत स्वागत करते हैं। और इसी के साथ में मंच जो है वो आदरणीय साधना शंकर जी को सौंप रही हूँ। जिस तरह से वो हमारे अतिथियों को करना चाहेंगे मंच आपको
आप सबको मेरा बहुत नमस्कार। असल में मैं भी अपने बाकी साथी
आदरणीय चित्रा जी, अब तक आवाज पहुंच रही है? आर यू लिस्निंग मी?
Yes. Okay. Sometimes I can hear, sometimes it's going away, but right now I can hear.
ओके ओके। चित्रादेव करुणी बनर्जी भारतीय मूल की अमेरिकी लेखिका, कवियत्री और ह्यूस्टन विश्वविद्यालय क्रिएटिव राइटिंग प्रोग्राम में लेखन की बेटियन जी मैक डेविड प्रोफेसर हैं। आपके कहानी संग्रह अरेंज मैरिज को 1996 में अमेरिकन बुक अवार्ड मिला। आपके दो उपन्यासों द मिस्ट्रेस ऑफ स्पाइसेस और सिस्टर ऑफ माय हार्ट, साथ ही एक कहानी द वर्ड लव को फिल्मों में रूपांतरित किया गया है। आपका काम काफी हद तक भारत और संयुक्त राज्य अमेरिका से संबंधित रहा है और अक्सर दक्षिण एशियाई प्रवासियों के अनुभवों पर ध्यान केंद्रित रहा है। आप बच्चों के लिए भी लिखती हैं। आपके यथार्थवादी कथा, ऐतिहासिक कथा, जादुई यथार्थवाद, मिथक और कल्पना के कई उपन्यास प्रकाशित हुए हैं। हम आपको बहुत ही सम्मान के साथ आपके विचार साझा करने के लिए आमंत्रित करते हैं।
Thank you.
You can ask her to speak.
You can start your speech, ma'am.
Me?
Yes, you.
Want me to start? Okay. So thank you very much. I am so happy to be here and to be part of this wonderful gathering on discussion of science fiction and fantasy. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how this relates to my writing and why the field of fantasy and science fiction is so important today. And I want to talk about some of the Indian writers that are writing wonderful things, as well as some writers from other countries of the world. First of all, I wanted to talk about how is it that fantasy and science fiction are so important. Why is it that they're so important today? I just want to ask the organizers, for how long should I speak? Because I can organize my talk that way. So someone just needs to tell me how long I should speak.
Can you hear? Chitra ji, can you hear me? I can hear you now. I couldn't hear anything before. Okay. How is about 15 to 20 minutes? Does that work for you? Yes. And will it be a conversation with people, or you want me to just talk? No, because I don't think there's a capacity to hold a conversation. So I think you just give your comments. Okay, I will give my comments on the importance of fantasy and science fiction in today's world and why especially Indian literature plays a great part. So what is very interesting in Indian literature coming out right now are all the books that are being written about epic fantasies. So these novels go back into our culture and they look at epics like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And of course, I want to start by talking about my own novel, The Palace of Illusions, and why that was so important to me. But before me also, many people have been writing novels about our epics. And since that time also, and even contemporary, Amish ji is writing so many things. And there are Anand Neelakantan has writing so many. And there are so many other people who are writing books based on characters from our epics. Our epics are timeless. The characters in them are very complex, and the moral dilemmas that they faced are not only interesting but very relevant in our work, in our world today. Therefore, for instance, in my novel, The Palace of Illusions, which is based on the Mahabharata but is told from Draupadi's viewpoint, I have tried to show how did the women of that time of the Mahabharata feel about issues that are just as relevant today as they were in their time. How did they feel about being able to direct their own lives, control their own lives, to receive respect from their societies and so forth? And I'm not the only one. There are so many beautiful other books that are being written about, for example, Sita's sister, Urmila. That's a beautiful book. And then, for instance, our gods have been looked at by writers like Amish
in Immortals of Meluha. And what we've done with these epic fantasies is that we've taken the ancient stories, but we are looking at the characters from a very contemporary point of view, so that the characters' questions become our questions as well. So that when Sita is asking, well, you know, she has, in my novel, for instance, the Forest of Enchantments, that is telling Sita's story from Sita's point of view. So the first thing that I have done in my epics, in my epic fantasies, is that I have put the woman in the center of the book, and I have had her ask questions which are relevant to her times, but also to ours. So that after Sita is rescued by Sri Ram, and he says to her, this is in Sri Lanka, he says to her, I have rescued you, but I cannot take you back home because, you know, Ravan has taken you and he has kept you captive and you are considered impure. I can't take you back to Ayodhya. And she says, Sita says, and this is from the Ramayana, but, you know, over the years we have forgotten some of these things that were central to the women of that time. Sita says, is it my fault that I was abducted? And, you know, obviously this is a question about victim shaming, which becomes very relevant in our times as well. So I think our Indian epic fantasies are particularly strong because they're bringing together at once, they're bringing together the ancient times, the magic and the mystery of those times, which are very powerful. They're bringing in social themes that continue to be powerful today. And they are bringing in important questions that women would like society to answer. The women want people to consider, how is it that women felt at certain times when these things were happening? Okay, so how does it feel to be the victim and then be punished for being the victim? And we know that as violence against women continue all over the world, and certainly, you know, in America where I'm living, and in India and in many countries, then through the epic fantasy, those social questions are raised in a very particular way. Epic fantasies are also amazing because they are taking place in a magical world. And just as a reader, from the time I was young, I was very amazed by the presence of magic. And I'm talking about, you know, other fantasies. So going back to some Western fantasies, for example, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, you know, it's a trilogy, and it is taking place in a magical world. It's a world that just draws the imagination. It draws the reader in while it's discussing some important questions of good and evil. So fantasy and science fiction, but I'll talk more about fantasy today because that is what I read and wrote and continue to write, is bringing us into a magical world. So what is fantasy saying? Fantasy is saying this world around us that seems so much like just an ordinary everyday world is actually filled with the magical. It's filled with things that cannot be easily explained. And in this world, which is the world of the imagination, the world that we have loved as children and from which we have fallen out sometimes as adults. When we read realistic fiction, of course it is, realistic fiction is powerful and wonderful, but it's lost that magic, that timeless magic of our childhoods, the timeless magic of our epics, the timeless magic of the fairy tales and folk tales that we grew up with. In Bengal, I was very blessed because I grew up with a lot of what we call Rupkatha in Bengal. And those are the fairy stories, but with deep meanings and with deep questions about what is right, what is wrong, and the battle between good and evil. So that is a battle that becomes very important in the world of fantasy. And the world of fantasy is enriched because that battle is not just fought on realistic lines, but also on lines of magical power. So going back to a novel like Palace of Illusions, it's filled with magical beings. The gods are there for sure. And the forms of the world seen as divine, for example, Ganga enters the story as a goddess, but she's also a woman, and she has a relationship with the human husband that she marries. So there is an interlinking in the world of fantasy. There is an interlinking between the magical and the real, gods and humans, and how are we to interact with them. And at a time where we're losing a sense perhaps of the world, of the earth as a power, as a goddess, it's very important for us to go back to fantasy and regain some of these wonderful connections. So going back to a novel such as The Palace of Illusions, in that I'm trying to create some important relationships between the human and the divine. So people sometimes ask me, when I was writing The Palace of Illusions, which was the most important relationship in Draupadi's life? Draupadi, she calls herself Panchali in that novel because she wants to belong to the land, not just be known as someone's daughter, but really belong to the land. Who is her relationship with that is the most important? And as I went through the novel, I was trying to answer that for myself. In fact, towards the end of the novel, when Draupadi is on the mountain and she is close to death, she finally understands that yes, she had 5 husbands, she had a father, she had a brother. They were all very dear to us. There was Karna, who was very important in her life as well, especially in her mind. But the most important character for her true friend, the only one who was really there when she was needed, was Krishna. And so these fantasy novels, these epic novels, can also create our relationship with the divine. They can bring in that aspect, which is not easy to bring into a realistic novel. So these are some things that are really important. It is very important for me to write about epic fiction because I don't want these old stories to be forgotten. There's so much of power in these stories that I want us to remember that. And seeing how popular fantasies, epic fantasies are right now in India fills me with great hope because people are finding these old tales to be very resonant. And writers are realizing that they can rewrite some of these novels. They don't have to just follow the old storyline. Now, in my novels, The Palace of Illusions and Forest of Enchantments, I wanted very much to follow the lines of the stories of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata because I wanted people to understand that my characters, Draupadi and Sita, were not just my imaginations. They were very much based on the Draupadi and Sita of the many versions of the Ramayans and the Mahabharats that we have come across over the years. Okay? But other writers, again, Amish is a very good example, are really taking these stories and molding them in very different ways. Or they're taking minor characters from these epics and they're creating novels about them. For example, Kavita Kane's Sita's sister, Urmila, is a minor character. She only appears a few times. She's important, but she's minor. But now the whole story has been written about her. There are books about Karna's wife. And you will notice that women play a very big part in these retellings of the novels, which I think is a wonderful thing because it is, again, positioning the spotlight onto something that has been ignored for many centuries, which is how were the women feeling, what they have been thinking, and what was going on in their lives behind closed doors, right? So these are some thoughts that I have had about fantasy and science fiction. Science fiction, of course, is also looking ahead. And here I'm thinking about some of the wonderful science fiction writers that are classics, let's say H.G. Wells or Jules Verne, and they were imagining things that are beginning to come true. In 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Jules Verne is imagining the submarine and so forth, right? So it will be very interesting to see as the writers are writing about astras and brahmastras and, Pashupat astra, how might this come to pass in our real world? So fantasy looks backwards and brings the truth from the olden times, brings the truth from the magical times into our world. Science fiction looks forward and is also pointing to ways in which people can change. Is time travel going to be possible? Is movement, immediate movement from one place to another using powerful technology going to be possible, where entire communities can be moved from one world to another? What science fiction is also bringing up some important questions about what is going on with our planet today. So in many of the science fiction stories, poems, and movies that we see, they are depicting a world that has been destroyed. And how are people to live in such a world? So these are all very important questions. They're just brought to us through a magical lens. And through that magical lens, we learn to see things that we might otherwise miss if we only look at realistic fiction. So my ending thought would be for all of you to, if you are already not reading science fiction and especially fantasy, please do so. Please look at all the wonderful writers who are writing now. And I've mentioned some of their names, but of course, if you go on the internet, you will find many other names and see how they're taking old stories, making them relevant to this time, and really teaching us a lot through the vehicle of these stories, through the vehicle of magic. We're really learning how to deal with some very important current social problems, especially those dealing with women, especially those dealing with maybe the underserved, the people who have been pushed aside by society, the minorities. So they are becoming important questions, questioners, I should say, in these novels. They're asking us to look at difficult issues about when can a woman stand up and say, enough, I will not compromise? When can a woman stand up and say, as Draupadi says in My Palace of Illusions, if they disrobe me, why should I feel ashamed? I am the victim. They are the criminals. They are the ones who should be ashamed. They are the ones who should be punished. So I end with this thought. For those of you who are already reading fantasy and science fiction, please do look at it with this lens of important themes in society. For those of you who are not used to seeing these epics being retold from interesting and unusual viewpoints, please do read women-centric fantasies, epic fantasies especially, and see how that might be changing your world. I'm currently involved in writing an epic fantasy, and for this one, I have chosen to go back to the Bengali fairy tales I grew up with. Because at the heart of those fairy tales, like I said before, is the battle between light and dark, the humans and the Rakshasas. Also, in these stories, there is the element of nature. Nature plays a very important part. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative, and that has made me think a lot about how are we treating nature nowadays, and how might nature come back in revenge to punish humanity. With so many natural disasters occurring all over the world nowadays, that is a very important question, and I want to leave you with that. Let us see how fantasy addresses these very important concerns in a unique and magical way. Thank you so much. And I hope that this has been useful to you, and I hope that's given you some thoughts about writers to read. And if you are perhaps students of literature, how you can write about fantasy, epic fantasy in particular, which is the great creation of India. In the West also, we have epic fantasies dealing with the Iliad and the Odyssey, again retold from women's points of view, as in the story of Circe, the story of Penelope. But we have also over here, as I pointed out, at least 3 Sita and Draupadi and Urmila and many, many others as well. So please encourage others also to read epic fantasy and science fiction. For many years, they have been pushed aside as not important, only for entertainment. This is not true. They have very, very deep themes. And when we read them with that in mind, they can change our world and how we look at it. So, namaste, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chitraji. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
So much for a very, very interesting and enlightening talk, and putting this session in a way in perspective about really what is the importance of science fiction and fantasy in the arena of literature. I just want to know if anybody wants to ask a question. Maybe we can try. You can come here and ask. Anybody wants to ask her a question? Just hang on, Chitraji, for abhi band mat kariye, please. Yeah, please come here because she can't hear.
Good morning from India, and I hope it's a good night for you, ma'am. Thank you so much for your enlightening words, and these are really inspiring for all of us. As you pointed out, science fiction always looks ahead, and I think it is a very important time for all of us to debate, discuss more relevant issues, and inspire our writers to bring those issues before the audience in an interesting manner. So that's a really thoughtful thing which you have already explained. So, ma'am, how do you think this is space technology expansion, science is growing? What is your viewpoint? How this generation will get inspiration like H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, and Isaac Asimov, and many others, including though Carl Sagan did not write in detail. He is my hero, but he worked also very seriously on science fiction and through his writings and films, other than astronomer. Thanks. What's your point, ma'am? Yes.
I think that's a great question. And one of the things that all of these people are telling us is, what is our place in the universe? They're telling us to think about that. What is our place in the universe? And often when we see people going into other planets, we see that they have destroyed Earth, and that's why they have to go for survival to another planet. Or they have destroyed their own planet, and now they're coming to Earth, where they will become like horrible monsters, right? If you look at, and the movies are a great way of looking at some of these stories and some of these ideas, because the movies, you look at the literature, you read the literature, but the movie puts it right. The movie is based on the books, puts it right in front of us. So I think there's a couple of different questions that we must think about. What is our relationship to our own planet Earth? As we are talking about intergalactic travel, and as we are talking about people who are leaving their planet to go to somewhere else, or, other non-human creatures coming to Earth, where do we fit in? It's actually a very spiritual question. Even if we look back at movies like 2001, A Space Odyssey, or all these space novels, Isaac Asimov is writing about that, or even robotics, right? What is the role of the human being in the universe? Especially as we see human beings destroying more and more of planet Earth. And we're seeing that every day, right? We're seeing it around us as, the climate is going out of control. There are floods, there are famines, there's just so much going on. So I think science fiction is particularly asking us, be aware. It's telling us be aware, beware actually, but also looking ahead at these extreme scenarios. Can we learn to change our behavior now? I think that is the big question of science fiction. It's shaking us up and showing us things. It's really like a glimpse into the future. And sometimes it's not a very pleasant future that it's looking at. But, and here is the magic of fiction, because it's doing it through fiction. If I were going to give you a lecture about how the humans are destroying planet Earth, you wouldn't want to listen to it. After a few minutes, you'd be like, yes, I understand. I've heard this before. But when through characters, the pain of people, the fear of people, the hopes of people are brought alive, that really does something very powerful and different. So I hope that has answered your question a little bit.
Yeah, Chitraji, there's one more question. That's the last question we'll take for this guest. And I request that please make it a question and not a comment, okay? Yeah.
Madam Namaste, I am Dr. Basavaraj Sadhur from Karnataka. Without description, I will go to the direct question. How you will relate the artificial intelligence with the fantasy? This is a simple question.
Yes. And that is a big thing that's coming in right now, right? And with artificial intelligence, again, it's like many of the things that are going on in the world and in the field of science fiction, we see that it is a dramatic change. And I'm thinking of the novel as well as the movie called I, Robot, where in this future time, there are these robots, artificial intelligence, creatures that are created to help us. But then through certain things that happen, I don't want to give it all away, things that happen, then their brains, as it were, are changed. And now they are controlling people instead of being controlled by them. So science fiction, therefore, looks at some of the fears that we have of technology and some of the worries, rightly so, that we have about manipulating technology, especially in the field of artificial intelligence, to create things that could be helpful or could become monstrous, right? And that is the dramatic balance that the novel, which deals with science fiction, is going to present to us. Okay, so that these characters, and not just robots, but also other ways in which artificial intelligence might arise in intelligent weapons that are so powerful that they can destroy the earth. Intelligent weapons in the hands of people who can no longer control them, right? So when you think about the field of artificial intelligence, I think it has already given rise to some amazing novels, but it's going to give a lot more. Other kinds of artificial intelligence being used in where human-like creatures are being produced. They're no longer babies that are being born, but they're, creatures that are being produced in laboratory situations, right? So it's just I am very interested to see what's going to come about in terms of when you take the ideas of artificial intelligence in many forms, and robots and robotics are definitely one of them. But, we could have characters like chat GPTs, and they might start influencing the world, right? They might start getting into people's heads. So I think it's an amazing new area for literature to delve into, because it is at once powerful, it is promising, and it's dangerous. And those three things are what great stories are made out of.
Thank you so much, Chitraji. We'll take the session forward right now, and I'll invite the next speaker, Mr. Era Murukan, to kind of give his intervention. Before that, I request Shashiji to please introduce him to the audience.
Thank you. I will say good night to everyone.
इरा मुरुगन जी प्रथम प्रख्यात तमिल कवि, स्तंभकार, कथाकार, आईटी, पटकथा लेखक, नाटककार और उपन्यासकार हैं। आप मलयालम से तमिल में अनुवाद करते हैं। आपका एक प्रसिद्ध उपन्यास मिलागू है और थिनाई अल्लाधु संजीवनी आपकी नवीनतम कृति है। आपके 11 उपन्यास, 11 कहानी संग्रह, 4 उपन्यासिका संग्रह, 2 कविता संग्रह, 2 प्रौद्योगिकी परिचय पुस्तकें और इस्लामी बैंकिंग पर एक पुस्तक प्रकाशित है। आपको इल्लक्या, चिंतनई, कथा और महाकवि उल्लोर परमेश्वर अय्यर आदि प्रतिष्ठित पुरस्कार प्राप्त हैं। हम आप सबकी बहुत ही मधुर करतल ध्वनि के बीच सादर आमंत्रित करते हैं आदरणीय इरा मुरुगन जी को उनके वैल्यूएबल थॉट्स के लिए।
Good morning to you all. Richard Wagner, like all stupid fellows, fell in love. And his friend asked him, can you tell me how much you love your lady love? Wagner said, I can't quantify how I love and how much I love, but I can play it on my violin. So about fantasy fiction or science fiction or whatever it is, if you ask me to write a story, I can do it. But if you ask me to talk about it, it's going to be a tad ordeal for me and more for you also. Anyhow, let's try to do it for the next 15 minutes. 1 minute. Most of us know about Jarasandhan. Jarasandhan is a major minor character in Mahabharata. His name, it was a derived name. When he was born, he was delivered in 2 components, like what Amazon delivers. Two components both were distinct. And so the king discarded that. And again, he had 2 wives and each delivered half a baby. So both the parts of the baby components were in the royal bin, and it was at that point of time a Rakshasi, a cannibal, came to rummage the bin. She found these two components, took them together, and both of them stuck together and became a live throbbing baby. So the story goes like that. So that is one. I want to then take the next example. It is about what happens in Chilapadigaram, the Tamil epic of 5th century AD. There is a woman with a baby, and she gets a friend to babysit for the baby. And when the babysitting was done by the girl, the baby started crying, and so the baby was fed by the friend. It choked on the milk and died. She took the dead body of the small child, infant, to all the temples in Kavaripattinam. Nothing could happen. And she went to Pashanda Chatan temple. There was a resident ghost, Yadagini or Dagini. Dagini said that she will get the child revived, and took the baby's corpse to the back of the temple and devoured it. But Pashada Chatan then said that if Yadagini has done something wrong, let me do something which will amend it. And he became the child. He went with the girl. For 21 years he was with the boy family, and then came back. So the story goes like that. These 2 stories are having a child, an infant in the narrative. Only one more. all this one, what I am going to tell is what happened in Kerala. A small village, a small hut or a small house, and surrounding it is a coconut grove. It is a sort of a very peaceful atmosphere. Suddenly one night, around midnight, a baby was found weeping. Sound was coming, a crying of a child. They sort of woke up. They woke up, went out, saw the surroundings. No baby was there, but it was again and again it was weeping and weeping and weeping. And from that day onwards, for the next 2 weeks or so, it was real torture for the householder, because the child was weeping. Suddenly it will start weeping, and suddenly it will start waking. And so it became a talk of the town or talk of the village. People came from the next villages also for this phenomena of child weeping at 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night afterwards. And it happened without any stopping. The sorcerer was brought in. No, he did some heavens, absolutely nothing happened. And one lanky chap came one day, that is after 15 days, he said that, I come for my mobile phone. It so happened that this guy was a coconut picker. So he plucked the coconuts from the trees in this parambu, and he was getting paid for it. What happened was, when he was climbing up the tree 2 weeks back to pluck the coconut, he got a phone call on his mobile, and at that point of time, the mobile, so he had to answer the phone, and he had the phone on a crevice in the branch of the coconut, and for the past 2 weeks he was trying to find out where the mobile was, and he found out it is there in the coconut tree. So he went up the tree, took back his mobile, and from there the baby was not there, it vanished. So all these three, you find there is something called fantasy suspension of disbelief continuum. So there is a fantasy, and the three fantasies involve babies, and there is some extraordinary thing happening, whether it is Jarasandha or the child which was fed on milk, which choked on milk, or the last one, the coconut picker's child creation. So all these things, there is a kind of continuum, fantasy suspension of disbelief continuum. The more you are ready to disbelieve anything, the more you will be getting the fantasy pleasure. Ecstasy you will be getting more rather. In my place, it so happened suddenly in Shivaganga, Tamil Nadu, there was a branch of astrology which came up suddenly. The kerosene stove did astrological predictions. How can a kerosene stove doing astrological predictions? Again, after 4 o'clock every evening, maybe in December or November, when the schools were closed, the mother of the house and the neighborhood ladies all came together. They found that this kerosene stove, Newton stove, has its own magical realistic properties. So they put two hands, each two boys sitting opposite each other, and putting their hands on the outer rim of the stove. And then somebody asked a question, will Srinivasan of the last house get an employment today, this month? and if then the stove will lift one of his legs and then chatak, chatak, it will do that dropping and coming back exercise twice or thrice. Based on it, it will be found that, so they say that Srinivasan will get employed within the next 2 months, or if it is not moving at all, he will not get employed for his life. So these kinds of, and it is something which is believable, which is a fantasy item which is believable, and I know that still I am believing in it because I am one of the boys who sat on the stove front. Still I don't know how it happened because I did not move the stove and my friend also did not move it. Somebody could have done it anyhow. So now coming back from all that to fantasy and suspicion and suspension of disbelief, the interesting thing about fantasy is I have written some 12 novels, of which 8 novels are based on magical realism, not fantasy per se. But fantasy was the basis of all the novels because from there only it springs back. From there only it springs back. And the latest novel is called lost thread. The latest novel is called Thinai is Fox Tail Millet. There I had a continuum of fantasy and non-suspension of disbelief, and what I did was what do you call that? Put in other components like magical realism, realism, surrealism, all these together, but it was a homogeneous, seamless, interesting, plot for the story. It came out well. I don't think whether I am not sure whether I will be getting time to complete what I was about to talk. It is about artificial intelligence and science fiction and fantasy fiction, but I don't think I am not having time. So some other time when we find or when I can write, I will do it for you, and I take leave now.
Thank you so much, Mr. Murugan, for bringing in the idea of the suspension of disbelief into the discourse for today. Now I'll invite Mr. Anil Menon next to speak. Before that, Shashi will please introduce him.
बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद मैम। अनिल मेनन जी का हाल ही में रचित उपन्यास है द कोइंसिडेंस प्लॉट, साइमन एंड शूस्टर। पूर्व में आपका एक कहानी संग्रह द इनकंसीवेबल आइडिया ऑफ द सन स्टोरीज है शेट प्रकाशित है। आपके उपन्यास हाफ ऑफ वर्ड आई से ब्लूम्सबरी को 2016 के हिंदू लिटरेरी अवार्ड के लिए शॉर्टलिस्ट किया गया। आपके पहले उपन्यास द बीस्ट विद 9 बिलियन फीट को 2009 के क्रॉसवर्ड पुरस्कार और कार्ल बैक्स्टर सोसाइटी के पैरालेक्स अवार्ड के लिए शॉर्टलिस्ट किया जा चुका है। आपकी कहानियों का अरबी, हिब्रू, इग्बो और रोमानियाई सहित 1 दर्जन से अधिक भाषाओं में अनुवाद हुआ है। आप बॉम्बे लिटरेरी मैगजीन के प्रमुख संपादक हैं। आप सबकी मधुर तालियों के बीच मैं सादर आमंत्रित करती हूं आदरणीय श्री अनिल मेनन जी को।
I'm sorry, the distinguished gentleman you just heard is not here. It is just me. My name is Anil Menon, and I write fiction, which means I worry about the problems of imaginary people. This is not a grown-up thing to do. It's a very childish thing to do. So this is not going to be a serious talk. We are discussing literature, and I'm wearing a shawl to prove it. But we're going to keep it light, right? So let me begin by talking about what is it that I do. So I write fiction, but I write a particular kind of fiction called speculative fiction. And speculative fiction spans a number of areas, genres. It spans science fiction, fantasy, surrealism, irrealism, the kind of stuff that you find when the constraints of realism are loosened. But the word realism is kind of tricky. So I don't want to go too much into speculative fiction is about non-realist literature. Realism, what we call real, does change over the centuries. So before I begin with the idea of speculative fiction, let me very briefly talk about the key component of speculative fiction is the imagination. And the imagination is a terrifying thing. It's really terrifying. We think of the imagination as something that all literature must have, right? But in reality, we can get away with a lot with not imagining stuff. When you actually let the imagination play, it's kind of terrifying. And you find that even in science, in the early days of science, there was a big attempt to keep imagination out of science. So for example, Jagdish Chandra Bose, when he wrote his book suggesting that maybe plants have consciousness, one of the criticisms that German biologists made against the book was that he's too imaginative, right? You're bringing in fantasy into science. And the idea is that we should be rational, fact-driven, evidence-based, and as little of the imagination as necessary. So imagination is scary, imagination is nerve-wracking. And the question is, how is it that in India, science fiction suddenly began to happen, right? And I think the answer has to do with the way technology came into our country. We were a technological people, we always had technology. But between the 1500s and the 1800s, there was a kind of a stagnation in what was happening here. And when the British came, and the French came, and the Portuguese came, when the Dutch came, we found ourselves faced with machines, mechanisms, processes, methods that we were not quite anticipating. The world had passed us by, right? And it happened in Bengal, it happened in Maharashtra, it happened in Tamil Nadu, where the colonial powers were centered. And it's precisely these places that we find science fiction begin to emerge, right? It is not a coincidence. So science fiction has something to do with technology. But what is technology, right? So we see rockets here, we see spacecraft, that's usually technology. Coffee machines are technology, chairs are technology, right? But this is a kind of the obvious kinds of technologies. Mic is a technology, right? I like to think of technology as a way to control how the world changes. Now, the world does change, there's no avoiding it, but can you control it? And if you can control it to prevent its changing or make it change in a certain direction, we need technology. This means that what we call technology is a subtle thing. So for example, yeah, robots are technology, ChatGPT is technology, but what about pensions? The idea of pension, is it a technology, right? Now if you look at the East India Company, when they came to India, they had in 1856, they had 300,000 soldiers. The East India Company had 300,000 soldiers. Of these 300,000 soldiers, 50,000 were Englishmen. The remaining 250,000 soldiers were Indians, or as they thought of themselves, Maharashtrians and Tamilians and so on. So why were these 250,000 Indian soldiers fighting for the East India Company? Didn't they have Marathas to fight for? Didn't they have Rajputs to fight for? Didn't they have the Mughals to fight for? Why were they fighting for the British? And it turns out that the British had realized that the Indian kings were so busy fighting among themselves, the governments were unstable. And when you have governments who are unstable, you have administrations that are unstable. And when you have administrations that are unstable, you have account keeping that is unstable. So a soldier who is given a salary is given a salary, and that is it. He is not given a pension. And what the British realized was by giving pension to the soldiers, guaranteeing pension, you would find that the soldiers would fight for you no matter what. So in the other kingdoms, the soldiers would betray, would cheat, would cross sides, but not with the British army. The British army did not have a traitor problem. And they did not have a traitor problem because even if the soldier died, his family would be taken care of. David Allen, who was a Christian missionary with the Bombay Asiatic Society, made an observation about this. He wrote a little paragraph which I would like to quote, which is very revealing. What he said was this. The wages of a sepoy in the infantry do not often exceed $3 or $4 per month. A subadar or captain, a rank not acquired before 25 or 30 years service, receives about $18 or $20 a month. And a subadar major receives rather more than $1 a day. The sepoys have generally families, and after a certain number of years, or when incapable of further service, they receive pensions for life. This system of pensions is much thought of and has great influence in the native army. Each sepoy hopes to live till he can return to his native village or some eligible place with an income for life for his past services. In Oriental countries, there is generally a strong desire to be employed in the service of the government, which is still true, and the English have no difficulty in forming regiments and obtaining recruits for their army, right? So if we tell the story of how the British conquered India, it's basically a story of how LIC conquered Europe with pension plans, right? It's exactly that. They basically pensioned their way to conquering this country, right? India was conquered by Indians and a pension scheme. So when we think of technology, you will not find a science fiction book that talks about pension schemes. You will not find double entry bookkeeping thought of as a technology. But these are the kinds of technology that radically change our world, how we relate to each other without anybody talking about it. Fiction does not talk about it, right? So I want to discuss, when we talk about science fiction, there are two questions you can ask, of course. What is science and what is fiction? And I will not bore you here with long, detailed definitions. In fact, we will see what can, instead of asking what is something is, let's ask what something can do. And if you look at science, you find that, let me do this little test that I do in workshops all the time, and I would like your cooperation. And I'm going to give you two sentences, right? The first sentence is this. The queen died. The queen died and the king died of a heart attack. Simple. Sentence one. The queen died and the king died of a heart attack. Okay. Now here is sentence two. The queen died and the king died of grief. Right. So my question to you is, which is more like a story? Sentence one or sentence two? Sentence two. Right. So I ask this question in every group I can imagine, and I find that there's no doubt. All of us know when something is a story, right? All of us know that the second sentence is more story-like. But the question is why? Why is the second sentence more story-like? They're conveying more or less the same fact that two people died. The queen died and the king died. In the first case, he died of a heart attack. In the second case, he died of grief. So what is the difference between these two statements? Might I suggest that the first statement is about causes. It tells the cause of death, a heart attack. It can be measured in the lab. You can see ECGs. You can prove someone died of a heart attack. The second statement is not about causes. It's about reasons. And reasons cannot necessarily be seen in the lab. You can't prove somebody died of grief. There are signs, sure. The person may not show any sign of grief. The person can die of grief, but it is speculation, actually. The first sentence is about causes. The queen died and the king died of heart attack. The second sentence is about reasons. And it's story-like. When you take a description, when you take an explanation, and you replace all the causes with reasons, it becomes a story. When you take a story and you replace all the reasons with causes, it becomes scientific. So for example, in something like the theory of evolution, if you ask, how did the elephant get here? Every culture, every civilization, every religion, every civilization has had an explanation for how life got here. And it's a story. But when the theory of evolution came by, you find that all the reasons are taken out. How did the elephant get here? Variety, chance, inheritance. That's it. Right? The destiny is replaced with dice. Fate is replaced with probability. And you have chance and randomness governing all. One of the reasons why evolution was so threatening to so many people was that it took away the stories that people had fallen in love with, the stories that you grew up with. What evolution did was to take away the story, take away the reasons for why life exists, why we here, why the universe is, and replace it with a completely cause-based explanation, right? Whenever you do that, whenever you find fiction is naturalized, when reasons are replaced with causes, it starts to become scientific. So science fiction is in a curious position. On the one hand, science is about causes. On the other hand, fiction is about reasons. And you have this genre which straddles both fields. It has to talk about causes in a reason, using reasons, right? So science fiction is in a curious hybrid literary form in which you find that if there is too many ideas, it becomes cold and mechanical. And people who read it will say, yeah, this doesn't give me that literature ka satisfaction, right? This is a little too heavy, right? Whereas if it gets too mushy, if it gets too much on the emotional side and it's all about reasons and not about enough about ideas, there's a certain kind of reader who will say, yeah, this is just literature, right? Science fiction has to walk that narrow line in which you are trying to talk about technological change, you're trying to talk of technology in a way that appeals to the heart. And it's not that this can't be done, it can be done, it's been done brilliantly, done beautifully. Chitra was talking about how movies are a good example. I would respectfully disagree, because it's like looking at Bollywood movies and saying that that is Hindi literature, right? Science fiction movies are a very different beast from science fiction literature. And science fiction literature actually does talk about the kind of changes that we might leave unnoticed, right? I will end with one poem by John Chardy. It's one of my favorite poems, and I inflict it on every audience that I can find. So I don't see why you guys should be spared. But in consolation, it's a good poem. So John Chardy was an interesting guy. He was the editor of Saturday Evening Post. He was the translator of Dante. He was as solid literary as you can imagine. He collaborated with Isaac Asimov in one of his fun projects, and the book of Dirty Limericks. So he's a fun guy, right? John Chardy. Here's a little poem, and it goes like this. Who could believe an ant in theory, a giraffe in blueprint? 10,000 doctors of what's possible could reason half the jungle out of being. I speak of love and something more, to say we are the thing that proves itself, not against reason, but impossibly true, and therefore to teach reason, reason. Gentlemen, I submit that this is also the task of science fiction, to teach reason, reason. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Menon, for that very interesting talk. This session, इस सेशन का मुझे अध्यक्ष बनाया गया है, लेकिन मैं वैसे इसकी पैनलिस्ट थी. So let me पहले थोड़ा सा just kind of thread the session together. If you see the topic of the session, it's quite very straightforward and prosaic, you know, fantasy and science fiction. It just leaves it there. So I must say that all our panelists have really thrown very interesting and enlightening light on both the elements of the topic given to us. Starting with Chitra ji, who spoke about the importance of, you know, epic fantasy in today's times and how it puts women at center stage and raises questions about our current times in a magical world. Then Mr. Murugan brought in the perspective of suspension of disbelief and how fantasy revolves around, and you can go into an ecstasy of fantasy. That's exactly the term he used. If you suspend your belief and go with the story completely. And of course, Mr. Menon has very nicely put science fiction and its whole purpose in place, where he says that, you know, it is trying to bring in reason into the story, but with the element of the story. So I, as an author myself, I write science fiction, and I will just wind up this session, and maybe if anybody in 5 minutes, and then if anybody has any questions on the panel sitting here, you're most welcome. So when I wrote my first science fiction novel, Ascendance, which came out in 2018, I had written it as a story, and you know, I have imagined two worlds, a world in the future where men and women are the competing species. So my novel actually deals with changing gender constructs because of the impact of technology. When I wrote the story, I never thought of it as a feminist science fiction. But everybody who reviewed it and the questions I got at all the in Lit Fests and all that I went to were on the, that it's a feminist novel, it's a feminist novel. So I thought, since I was a panelist, I had thought that I would speak a little bit about the concept of feminist novels in science fiction. Just to take, since I did work on it a little bit, I'll just go through a little bit of what I had, thought about it and written about it. So, what do you think is a feminist novel? It's simply put, it's, there's a lot of theory. I'm just talking as an author and as a person who reads. I'm not talking as an academic on feminism or anything. It's simply a story which tells about the concerns of women and the issues that face women around them, And, but not all novels that deal with the women's stories are feminist novels. So, if you think of it, books that come under the Mills and Boon category or the 50 Shades of Grey, things like that, they're not necessarily feminist novels. They're stories about women. But there is a very interesting definition given by an American author, Roxana Gay, about a feminist novel. And she says it is one that not only deals explicitly with the stories and thereby the lives of women, it is also a novel that illuminates some aspect of the female condition and or offers some kind of imperative for change and or makes a bold or unapologetic political statement in the best interests of women. So what is in this kind of framework of a feminist novel, where does science fiction fit in? Science fiction has put in very good perspective by Mr. Menon here. But I think as a writer of science fiction that the biggest advantage of writing science fiction, what he said, imagination is, you said it's dangerous. So it's also a freedom. Imagination also makes you free because as an author of science fiction, you can actually imagine any world, any time, any space and deal with the issues that are in our contemporary societies in a different perspective, in a different manner. So actually the imagination part of science fiction makes you, gives you a lot of freedom to write. And for women especially, if you see women writing science fiction, let me tell you, he said, Mr. Menon said it's come of age in India, but let me tell you, when I wrote my book and I was trying to look for a publisher, women writing science fiction is is looked at, it's a lot of surprise, and it took me a long time to get some publisher. Rupa finally brought out my book to find a publisher then. Now, because technology is overwhelming us so much, yes, science fiction really has come of age in our country. So what have women been exploring when they write science fiction? Just, I'll go through 2-3 famous writers. Again, I'm, because he gave a very nice history and evolution of science fiction. He said that most of science fiction evolved in Bengal and the southern states. And actually one of the earliest science fiction stories written by a woman came out in 1905 in Bengal, and it's called The Sultana's Dream by Rokhaya Begum. Okay, and one second, where did it go? Okay, so what is Sultana's Dream? In short, it is about the. It's a story of a place called Lady Land where gender roles are reversed. So the males are in the Mardana and the women are outside. But Lady Land is not isolated. Okay, it's not some where Wonder Woman was born. If you remember, it's one island where there is nobody else, no man. But Lady Land is very much in a community, and the queen there fights wars. She trades with the men. So Sultana's Dream was one of the first, I would say, empowering kind of, not dystopic science fiction stories that came out. Then women write dystopias also, and I think the most famous one is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. And between these two themes of empowerment and dystopia, there is also a middle path that women have taken. And in this, the most famous 1969 book is by Ursula Le Guin. I hope I pronounce it rightly. The Left Hand of Darkness. And in this, it's a story about a man from Earth who travels to the planet Glethen, where people have no fixed gender, and how he struggles to relate. So what does women on a spectrum have been writing about in science fiction. They try to imagine social constructs that are not mired in misogyny and patriarchy and reimagine their bodies and biological bondages in a different manner. They can be empowering stories or they can be dystopian stories. So, like in my own book, Ascendance, it's about the time when men and women do not need each other for reproduction. So, in my imagination, they become the competing species. My next book, which I am now finished, it's Continuum. It's taking a look at all the questions women have faced from the past and into the future. So, as a writer, I don't write dystopias. I write about possible futures. But why is it important for science fiction writers, especially women, to continue writing? Apart from making the woman the center stage, I think the point that Chitraji made, that they bring in, whether it's in an epic fantasy or in a science fiction, they bring in questions that plague all of us. Either they bring them center stage, like in her books in the past. In science fiction, they bring them to center stage, but in a different setting and an imaginary setting. So, science fiction gives women writers and their audiences the ability to imagine unshackled and different lives. And when you imagine ideas that resonate and have appeal, there might be a nudge to do something better. Frankly, I try to find some data whether science fiction or fantasy written by women has any impact on young girls, and the only thing that I found on the net was a 2018 study by a woman media center in the US of teenage girls. And it said that young girls are inspired and motivated by science fiction and women's superheroes, and they feel, and I quote, they make them feel like they can achieve anything they put their mind to. So it's a very anecdotal thing, but still it's something to think about. And that brings me to a very prosaic statistic that the World Economic Forum brought out a gender gap report last year, and it said that it will still take 136 years for the gender gap on this planet to ever be bridged. 136 years is something, it's a future, it's like science fiction, let me put it that way. So it's for women, it's a long struggle to bring their issues and to come, up to bridging the gender gap. So as writers and as readers, as writers primarily, the only thing we can do is to continue writing and bringing out issues that make people think and, dwell on issues, and as readers, for you to read and keep us encouraged. So thank you very much, and now I open the floor for any questions anybody has from the panel here. Yes. You want to ask, let me start with.
Okay, I'll just stand up. Yeah. I just want to make an observation that he beautifully brought up that difference between reason and facts and all. Science fiction also seems to ask some moral questions which are not present today. So it's not just about thinking of technology of tomorrow, but what moral questions they pose. For example, ChatGPT today, there is a moral question that what ChatGPT is generating is something from already generated stuff. So is it moral that you don't give credit to those people who have generated? So I don't read too much of it, but one of the fiction works which is very famous is Solaris of Stanislav Lem. And in that, there's a question asked. The main theme is that a person goes to the Solaris, and whoever he has loved and lost, they reappear. And the impact of that is the whole story. So I don't want to tell the story. But after seeing that movie, there is a comment. One guy said, I lost my favorite doll, and I always used to think how wonderful it would be if I could get it back to life. After seeing this movie, I was terrified. So what happens in such situations, right? Extremely complex things, they come up from science fiction. So if Anil Menon can sort of tell us some of those major things would be that will also be illuminated as to the addressing the moral questions of the future.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. And the thing is, I do not believe literature, this might be a little surprising, has a moral purpose. I think that it can have a moral purpose, but I don't think it's a necessary feature of it. Goebbels was a literature PhD. Darko was a writing workshop. Hitler he had a chapter called How to Read in his Mein Kampf. Stalin was a great reader. He was a poet when he was young. Saddam Hussein wrote 3 novels. In fact, I believe that America invaded Iraq just to stop him from writing more novels. Literature does not make us better people, but I think if you are a good person at heart, it doesn't make you worse. So that is, I think, really that religion. But I don't think literature is meant like it has any. It's very protean. It's very shape changing, right? And every generation finds meaning in it. I don't think we should say it should do X, and you leave that possibilities to emerge in the civilization. So I would say that yes, it is true science fiction raises interesting moral questions, but Elon Musk is as inspired by science fiction as the anti-Elon Musk, right? So it goes both ways.
No, I think it's not a discussion. No, you follow up with him outside. Then we'll give others a question.
I'd just like to ask you a question. I was fascinated by this distinction that you make between cause and reason. In your own fiction, you just give me an example how you tread this fine balance.
Yeah, so the coincidence plot, it is not a science fiction story, it's a regular story. But the idea was what is coincidence, right? And you can approach it through emotional angle, you can approach it through a kind of what probability says, there are no coincidences, everything is a coincidence. We are here because of a 15 billion year old coincidence, right? But that's not how we feel, that's not how we see ourselves. So using a novel, for example, to talk about coincidence, and every aspect of the novel is decided by me, right? I put down the sentences, yet I'm talking about coincidences. So I like, that's one example of how you approach something that is, the very form itself fights against that something that is being discussed. So science fiction in a sense it does the same thing. So it's talking of technological change, but using a means that is very, very strange actually. So hope that...
I've read your fictions.
Is it kind of ironic?
It's very ironic. It's very, very ironic.
Yeah, like in the marriage plot.
Yes. It's very ironic. Yeah. But that's why in a sense it's very modern, because irony is a kind of a modern taste, right? Yeah.
I want to ask Murugan sir. When I read your fantasy, I see the fantasy as an extension of folklore. So how the folklore, folk traditions, folk stories, how they seep and extend into fantasy. So the relation between folk and the modern fantasy. That's what I wanted to ask.
The relation between folk and fantasy fiction, or?
Yeah.
Okay. Folklore. Okay. If you want to take folklore as a discussion point, from folklore many other genres have sprung, but taking folklore as a direct, what do you call, sorry,
I'll just call it. Yeah.
So after the World War, the kind of science fiction we got was largely optimistic, and it was utopia and everything. But today, what we get is so disturbing that it's hard to watch at times. It's all dystopia. So, what in your opinion, both of you who write science fiction, what in your opinion is the reason for this shift that has happened?
I think if you're saying about watching, then you're really talking about movies and you're not talking about books. I think it's not that everybody is writing dystopia. So some reason, when you say science fiction, it is assumed to be in a sense dystopic, And there is this thought process when somebody reads science fiction, that you're writing about a world which has happened, which should never have happened, and what we live today and the current reality is the value to which we have to come back to. And that is not necessarily how everybody approaches it. Your question is something to do with after the world wars, it was optimistic, there was about time travel and stuff like that. One reason maybe it's becoming dystopic is that, or kind of dystopic, is because the technology is changing much faster today than it was at that point of time. You know, the changes. In fact, what we thought of as science fiction and what writers had written as science fiction earlier used to take 30 years to come true. Today it's taking 5 years, you know, and it's coming true. So the world is actually bewildering and overwhelming, both for readers and for writers. So maybe in that sense it is getting more dystopic, or you can think of it, it is writing about more possible realities of humanity, you know. It's a different way of looking at it. You want to add? Yeah. You want to say?
Just 2 minutes. It's about AI, artificial intelligence. For the past 2 days, I am hearing more about artificial intelligence. It's not something we have to be afraid of. We have to meet it. Today there is one chat GPT. Tomorrow there will be more than one. And within a month, it will be a kind of population of chat GPT. Incidentally, yesterday, I gave a kind of criterion to chat GPT, single liner, humor, science fiction. And it gave interestingly, in a future ruled by sentient coffee machines, one brave barista is determined to spill the beans on all the plot to enslave humanity, one latte at a time. Beautiful.
You were referring about imagination is terrifying, the very theme. And sir, as we understood that human evolution, and we are adopting in since many ages because of our imagination, and we are preparing our future. And this is also one sort of part of science fiction concept. How do you define, without imagination, we as a human, so-called Homo sapiens, can survive on this planet? So this belief of your terrifying concept, can you once again elaborate from this point of view?
I don't have a definitive answer, but I think we can survive without imagination. I think a lot of societies go to great trouble to make sure that students don't have the imagination. We can just look at our schools, right? I don't think it's, everything can be ritualized, everything can be turned into rote, right? And as long as the world is not changing too rapidly, societies can literally stay static, right? But what happens is when situations don't change, when the weather conditions change, when invaders come, you find that the ways in which you kept your society controlled, unimaginative, suddenly becomes very proper, right? And that's when you start to find ferment in a society. So it's not necessary that imagination is absolutely essential for us. It is advisable for us. Right?
Can you start on your comment on it? Yeah.
On what? Sorry.
Imagination is not needed, so-called concept.
You know, I tend to beg to disagree with him, because I think the whole human society is based on imagination, and you know, everything, if the, even a nation state and all the ideas are basically an imagination. So I don't think imagination is, what he's saying that you know, imagination is suppressed, that is true, and that is why, because imagination leads to so many other things. When people imagine better futures, better visions, better worlds, they will move towards them, work towards them, rise towards them. But it is, I think, an intrinsic part of being a human being. That is my you know, take on this. No, I think we need to stop. I have this thing, and I must thank the audience for being so participative. Yes, but I must say that yes, as per the World Economic Forum, we will take 136 years, because not a single lady in the audience asked a question. Okay, so yeah, please change that.
I didn't want to ask a question because, you know, so many things. Okay, right, so I have couple of questions, right? So one is about the suspension of disbelief, right? Which, of course, is something that is expected in the beginning of any fictional work, not necessarily just science fiction and fantasy. What I feel science fiction and fantasy novels especially do, not always, magic realism is a different game, is that they focus a lot on world building, right? And in this world building, what they do is they change reasons to causes, I guess, right? And that's what is the fascination for science fiction, right? Because you read it and everything becomes causally explained, and that's why you read it. And so your distinction between I guess, hard science fiction and soft science fiction. Nevertheless, I mean, that's the thing, right? So I really want, if you have something to say about this connection between the suspension of disbelief, to what extent does, you know, is it expected? Is it just expected in the beginning or throughout? I think it's just in the beginning because, you know, you suspend it and then you read, because if you are asked to do it again and again, I think it'll be a bit too much. And the second is about, you know, causes and reasons. I think, you know, you are looking at just causes because you have suspended your disbelief. So I guess that's a question. I mean, you challenge, so I don't know if there's a clear question. But yeah.
I will just address the first part very quickly. Yeah. I say that suspension of disbelief is overrated. Our Indian institutions, they focus on a different idea, which is dhwani, which is closure. And I think closure is far more important, right? So I don't have to explain, I just have to say Caesar in the Roman amphitheater. And immediately you see the amphitheater, right? So you close a lot of sentences I don't need to write because you will write them down, right? And there's no disbelief involved in that. But without closure, no story would work because you'll be spending just giving details. One of the reasons computers find it so hard to understand is because they can't really do closure well. They need all the details, right? When you say Jack ate a hamburger, where, right? It makes all the difference in the world how you interpret that statement. So closure is, I think, the real key to literature.
I think with that we'll close today's session, you know. Thank you so much everybody on the panel. Thank you.
हमारा आज का यह सत्र बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण रहा और निश्चित रूप से हमारी अंतर्दृष्टि के नए द्वार खुले। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद प्रेषित करती हूँ मैं मंचासीन सभी अतिथियों का और साथ ही सभागार में उपस्थित सभी मनुष्यों का। 12 बजे हमारा दूसरा सत्र प्रारंभ होगा। जी।